Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, ThinEdgeOfTheWedge.com. I grew up in the Midwestern town of Elgin, Illinois, where everyone in the community had parents or grandparents who came from Europe to escape the Tsar and pogroms, and not because of the Holocaust. Yet, in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, with the US Army, and it changed our lives forever.
Today, we have a very special and distinguished guest from the United Kingdom. Her story is a remarkable example of speaking up against anti-Semitism that will greatly inspire us all. Right Honorable Joan Ryan was the United Kingdom Member of Parliament for Enfield North for 18 years. She resigned from the Labour Party in February 2019, citing the anti-Semitism crisis that was overwhelming her party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, and his refusal to action or condemn it. June 2019, Joan was appointed as the honorary president of Labour Friends of Israel, having been the organization's chair since 2015. Joan was appointed as a member of Her Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council in 2007, which advises Her Majesty the Queen. Joan served as a member of the United Kingdom government for 5 years as a government whip and a minister in the Home Office. In July 2007, she was appointed as the Prime Minister's Special Representative to Cyprus. Right Honourable Joan Ryan is currently the Executive Director of ELNet UK, a non-profit organization dedicated to strengthening relations between Europe and Israel based on shared democratic values and strategic interests. Joan, we are extremely honored to have you on our show. Welcome.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Phyllis. It's my pleasure to be here. My honor to be asked to do this with you.
Thank you. So our first question is, what is your personal motivation to speak up against anti-Semitism and to support Israel?
I think there's probably three main reasons. One, I think, is my upbringing. My parents were immigrants from Ireland to the United Kingdom, from the Republic of Ireland to England during and just after the Second World War. And they faced a lot of prejudice. There was a lot of prejudice against the Irish. They could, trying to find somewhere to live. There was notices that said things like no dogs, no blacks, no Irish need apply. It was just really hard for Irish people. And so they kind of stuck together a bit like communities do when they need to protect themselves and each other. But instead of becoming embittered, my parents brought me and my three sisters up to believe that you had to be fair. Fairness really mattered, tolerance, decency, and not judging others by some of those criteria that leads to racism: ethnicity, race, creed, sometimes country of origin, all the reasons why people can be racist. We were brought up to think that was wrong, and if you were being fair, you wouldn't be judging people on the basis of those characteristics, that we were all the same. So I think that was kind of fundamental. And then I joined the Labour Party in the 1970s, the late 1970s, as a student. And I joined it because at that point in the UK, there was a big upsurge in racism, mostly against Black and Asian. And we had all the anti-Nazi League marches against this. And I joined that movement because I absolutely believed it was wrong to be racist. So I joined the Labour Party to fight racism. Of course, the irony of that is that 40 years later, I find I'm leaving the Labour Party for the very same reason, because of racism, so I could stand up to it again. Which, you know, an irony, yes, but actually very distressing. And I think the third reason that that brought into very sharp focus for me how dangerous anti-Semitism is. The reason why I know it's racism, because one of the things we found out during the terrible Corbyn years was that people often didn't relate to the idea of anti-Semitism. We did some focus groups, those of us who formed a small group to fight this. And when we'd say to people, or the moderators would say anti-Semitism, when they got comfortable, they'd kind of say, well, what, you know, what exactly is that? How does it happen? Why? Who does it hurt? Or what do you mean? Why is it racist? When we said it's racism against Jews and explained it, people then got it and rejected it. So what we were discovering is, you know, many people don't really understand why anti-Semitism is racism. They think it's something different or separate, or they just don't really know what it is. But I did know what it was. During the 1980s, I worked as an oral historian for the Imperial War Museum in London. And I was a freelancer, and I was interviewing civilians, mainly Bevan boys and evacuees, people who'd been, you know, in civilian life during the Second World War, firefighters, things like that. And towards the end of January one year, before we had a Holocaust Memorial Day, I saw this huge article in our local paper, the Hendon and Finchley Times, and it was by a man called Freddie Noller, who was an Auschwitz survivor. And of course, the 27th January is Auschwitz liberation, as we all know. But I didn't know a lot about it. I never had any contact with Jewish people, really. I didn't grow up knowing a Jewish community, and it wasn't a community my parents were in any way connected to. So I knew really very little about the Jewish community. But what I didn't have was some kind of, you know, prejudice that I was brought up with towards anybody. So when I saw this article by Freddie Noller, I asked the keeper of our department, the head of the department, why aren't we interviewing people like this? He was in Auschwitz. This is unbelievable. He's here in North London. We should be talking to him, surely. She said, you better put the project paper together and go and do that, because the full-timers were still interviewing Gallipoli veterans from the First World War. I thought, you know, by the time they get round to these people. So I went to see him, and honestly, ladies, it was an education. A heartbreaking one, really. Except that, you know, he was so strong and positive. It did help you to see some of the real, you know, the best and the worst of human beings, really. He being the best and the strength he'd shown. And of course, the worst, what he'd witnessed and experienced in Auschwitz. So he then put me in touch with some other organisations. I ended up interviewing people who'd been in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, and people who'd been in ghettos, and people who'd been on forced marches and different work camps. And I think what this didn't, you know, make me not be anti-Semitic, because I wasn't anti-Semitic to start with. But what it did do was drive home to me what the ultimate price to pay could be for anti-Semitism, and for letting it enter into your political system and rot your democracy. So it's a bit long-winded, sorry. I think they're the reasons why I had such strong views about it.
Very personal experience, right? Experiencing discrimination as an as
My
a
parents.
family in the United Kingdom, and also hearing the personal experiences of Holocaust survivors who have been in Auschwitz. So that motivated you to fight racism and anti-Semitism included. Does it also influence your activism for Israel?
To a degree, but that's not really, as far as I'm concerned, Israel's a democracy. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. It doesn't get everything right, but it should be judged by the same standards as any other democratic nation, not continually held up for criticism that is of a completely different order than any other democracy it is held to. And so I look around and I think, well, why is Israel subjected to that kind of excessive and unfair scrutiny? Scrutiny is a good thing, but not when it's being used to persecute unfairly. And my conclusion is that anti-Zionism is the modern day iteration of a centuries-old hatred called anti-Semitism. And so there is that link. But when I first became an MP, I was asked would I join Labour Friends of Israel. Well, I was an easy one to get, really, because I just said, yes, of course I will. But not without thinking. I knew it was important. So I joined, and I went to Israel a few times with Labour Friends of Israel, and I supported them. So in 2015, when they asked me to accept the appointment of chair, I knew things weren't as easy as when we had Tony Blair or Gordon Brown as leader. I knew things were more difficult, and the party had, developed a somewhat a somewhat anti-Israel set of politics that were couched within their note pro-Palestinian, but you can be pro-Israel and pro-Palestinians. We're not at war with Palestinians. We want a decent life for all. Labour Friends of Israel believe in two states, and that's very much what I would like to see. So when they asked me to be chair, I accepted that appointment, and I knew it would be hard. But about 6 weeks later, the new leadership election came along, and by the September, we knew Jeremy Corbyn would be leader. So I knew then it was going to be very difficult, but I also knew I'd accepted it in good faith. I'd been offered it in good faith, and you don't walk away when things get tough, because I think for Israel and for our Jewish communities, I think they know the true measure of a friend is we stand by people in the hard times. It's all so easy when it's easy.
That's really what you just said is so compelling and brings us to the question of what did happen when you had new leadership in the Labour Party. Tell us about that anti-Semitism in the party and how it developed, and how did it manifest itself?
I suppose what you have to remember is, although we knew that Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters were hard left, if you've been in this political, very democratic environment all this time, you're not really, we thought it would be difficult, but we weren't expecting it to be completely overwhelmed with the kind of politics that really I think are toxic and have caused a huge amount of damage to the Labour Party. And the speed at which it happened when the hard left captured the leadership of the Labour Party, the speed at which this kind of virus of anti-Semitism spread was absolutely shocking. And then, of course, we had 4 years of this incident after incident and a lack of action, one revelation after another. So in terms of the first incident, I remember, and I stood up at a full Parliamentary Labour Party meeting and asked the leader, Jeremy Corbyn, what he was going to do about it. And this was young students, 18 and 19-year-olds at Oxford University, went along to their Labour Club meetings. You'd think we'd want to encourage youngsters to get involved. You know, they're the pipeline to future leaders. And they go along and they were called Zios as a term of abuse. And it was made very clear they weren't part of the community of the good and they weren't welcome because they were not just Jews, but Zionists, which I just think is, and it took him a very long time to decide to appoint someone to look into it, No action. That's just long grass, look into it, review, you know. When I asked him what he was going to do about it, he said, "Why are you asking me?" The first indication that as leader, he had no intention of acting on these things. There are all kinds of things. People, you know, all kinds of people were allowed to join the Labour Party who are not Labour Party. They're what we call hard left, Socialist Workers' Party, Workers' Revolutionary Party, Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist Leninists of Great Britain. Honestly, Evelyn and Phyllis, every single hard left and crank in the country joined the Labour Party. The Labour Party went from about 150,000, 200,000 members to 500,000 members over the space of less than a year. And many of these would have been decent people with the right leadership, but with the leadership we had, well, you know, there was MPs who were Labour MPs who were currying favour with him by keeping their heads down or behaving as badly. So if they're doing that, you can't wonder that ordinary members start doing the same thing. We had then revelations, pictures of him laying a wreath at the grave of those who the terrorists who were behind the killing of the Israeli athletes in Munich at the Munich Olympics. I mean, this is horrendous. How could we have a Labour Party leader, a man who wants to be Prime Minister, doing that? And many, many other situations. People saying the most appalling things on Twitter, abusing those who were standing up to them and standing up to Israel, because much of it was anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. And we were warning against it all the time and saying, look, this is anti-Semitism. And people were saying, but you can be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. No, you can't. You can't. One of the lessons I think we had to learn from this is you're not going to be able to stand up to anti-Semitism unless you stand up to anti-Zionism, because, as I said, it is just the latest iteration in this hatred. But he wasn't going to have that, not at all. There was inquiries that were called a whitewash. People would say the most appalling, abusive things. They'd be suspended, and then you'd hear nothing more, and you'd find a couple of months later, it was like a revolving door. They were back in the party when really they should have been expelled. People were just being persecuted at meetings. Jewish Labour MPs. Now, I'm not Jewish, and it was pretty abusive to me. But I think for the Jewish Labour MPs, I think it must have been absolutely appalling. It's a whole nother layer. You know, they're calling me names. You know, I'm not Jewish. I don't have. I think that fear that was quite evident to me, that our Jewish community and our Jewish Labour MPs felt a sense of real unease. When we came to the election in 2019, there was a survey done, and 83% of the Jewish community said they were fearful of Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister. I imagine that, you know, the Labour Party, the party that should be the very bulwark, the first point of defence against this kind of thing, has made a whole community of people fearful because they're being treated in a racist way. Honestly, it's more than I could live with. Just shocking. It crosses a red line, there's no question. So that's what was going on. And then people were saying, oh, well, don't worry, because, you know, the public will hate him. They hate those kind of left-wing, hard left politics. He won't get elected. He's not left-wing, he's hard left. It's another layer altogether. You know, we've got anti-Semitism, as you know, from the far right and the hard left, and they're both really extremists. So we came to an election in 2017, and he did so much better than anyone had predicted. And he was only in single-figure seats away from being able to form a coalition with the other smaller parties and get into Downing Street. If he'd have won another half dozen or more seats, he could have started negotiations. So electoral viability or non-viability was no longer an argument, and it never should have been. This is a case of, it's a moral argument that we should be making, not electoral viability. So that changed the nature of how those of us who were willing to stand up felt about it. And, you know, one of the worst things was, obviously, those who are spouting anti-Semitism should be expelled, but or those who are downplaying the Holocaust, they too have to be held to account. But those who just keep their heads down, you know, who are silent, there are consequences to that silence. And they are public representatives who want to be in government. And I think if you're not going to speak up on an issue like this, if you haven't got, it's not bravery, because we're not at risk. Bravery is when you're really frightened. And I'm not frightened, but it does take a little bit of moral courage. It isn't the easiest thing to do. But why on earth have you stood for Parliament if you're not going to do the right thing? And I just think that was one of the most disappointing things that happened during this. So on we go, and we get to a point where I just knew that I needed to stand up and say, you know, you can't vote for this man, because it was obvious that we could have another election at any point in time. And I knew if I did that, he would expel me. And they were trying to oust me from my seat, but they weren't quite managing it, but it was very unpleasant. I had death threats. You don't have to be Jewish to be told you're going to be shoved in the ovens. That's absolutely shocking. There was people sat in cars outside my constituency office staring at my staff, two wonderful women doing all my casework with me, being treated to that. And they're not public figures. They hadn't said anything. But the fact that they worked for me. We had a train, like an Auschwitz train, pasted to my office door. I mean, they're just vicious. Really, really unpleasant. So knowing an election was coming and all this was going on, and then Jewish Labour women were leaving the party. Jewish people per se were leaving the party. There was actually a demonstration in Parliament Square called Dayenu, enough is enough.
Dayenu.
Yeah?
Dayenu, yeah.
And, you know, no one could believe that the Jewish community of London were having to demonstrate in Parliament Square against the Labour Party. So, you know, I decided I was going to have to resign, because if I'd said what I said and didn't resign, he'd expel me. And then if I carried on saying it, people would say it's sour grapes. I thought, you've only really got this one this one bow and arrow in this fight, and I've got to make it count. So I resigned and I called him out for anti-Semitism. I did it in a national newspaper, and then for 24 hours and turned into 48 hours, I did every last bit of media, national and local, that I possibly could. I did it on purpose. And they said it's a vendetta. No, it's not a vendetta. There's nothing vendetta about it. I've been warning him for 4 years. It was not a vendetta. What it was an exposing of the toxic nature of his politics, the danger it posed, not just to the Jewish community. And people would say to me, why are you standing by them? And one newspaper continually called me the Jewish Labour MP. I used to phone them up, and a national paper, and say, I'm not Jewish. And they said, oh, we're sorry. I said, no, it's not an insult. I don't mind. But the whole point is that I'm not Jewish, because one of the things I absolutely believe is this isn't just a problem for Jews. This is racism, and it rots democracy. It rots our society. What kind of world do we want our kids and our grandkids to grow up in? It's not that kind. I'm absolutely clear about that. And I just think it's unforgivable to stand back and say it's Jews' problem. We don't say that about any other form of racism. It's, if you believe that racism is wrong, we all stand together. And so I left, I called it out, I did as much media as I could, and I continued to fight it right up to, well, beyond the election, till he resigned.
I wanted to ask you about the consequences of this action, but with in a limited time frame. You said something very important twice. You said that it rots democracy, anti-Semitism and racism, which I just wrote a blog post in Times of Israel, which started out with this premise. I very much believe it's not a Jewish problem, but a humanity problem. So what is it about England, you know, as an American, Evelyn's Dutch, but as an American, you know, we were, you know, British for a long time, and we study history. What is it in Magna Carta, and what's going on in Britain to become so hateful towards groups of people?
Well, I mean, I can only talk about, in a way, this experience, but I think it holds a mirror up to many other forms of hatred and what happens. I think there are lessons we've learned from this. And I think there are some parallels in the United States as well with the hard left. I think one of the lessons is how important leadership is. Leadership really matters. You've got to have good and decent leaders, strong leaders, but with a good vision and a commitment to democracy. I think that really, really matters. I think you've got to absolutely stand firm against extremism at the very outset. If you wait and think it's going to get better, or it's all right, we'll have an election, he'll be gone, you know, the demands of the hard left or the far right can never be satisfied. You've got to stand up to it immediately. Whilst you're not at any risk, you're not worried about your children or anybody else being attacked. I just think of the things I've read about the Second World War and how good people did nothing and looked the other way. And by the time they were willing to help, they were too scared to help because they were then at risk.
Yeah.
So you'd stand up immediately. I think we just have to realise that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and you will never snuff out anti-Semitism unless you also stand up to anti-Zionism.
Yeah, we do see it. We do see it all. I think all over the world that the hard right and the hard left express themselves anti-Semitic. The hard right maybe not so much anti-Israel, but more anti-Jewish as a people. And the hard left very much anti-Jewish state. We see it all over the world, and we also see that the moderate left and right are a bit under pressure from those groups.
Well, I think the hard left, Evelyn, use the plight of the Palestinians as a shield for all they've ever said, for all the stirring up of trouble, all the hatred of BDS and things like that. It's not done the Palestinians one iota of good, because that isn't really what it's about. They're not seeking peace. They are seeking division. They're not building bridges and coexistence. They're driving peoples apart. And we'll, if we leave it to them, we will never see peace. But I do think that there's some hope in the story I've been telling you, in that, first of all, it always feels right to do the right thing. I pass politicians now in my working life now, and all those who I think should have stood up, they look a little embarrassed. I hope some lessons have been learned there. I only have to get up in the morning and look myself in the mirror, and I've never regretted my actions. I don't say it wasn't hard. It was. And the year after I left Parliament, after all that time, that was hard. It was the job in a million, the job I'd always wanted. I really thought that kind of public service absolutely mattered. You're at the centre, the hub of all this decision-making activity. It's a very exciting job. You feel like you've got this possibility of, if you're not in power, at least influencing and putting into practice the things you believe in. And, to have to walk away from that, it's hard, but it's the right thing to do. And the reason I think it's right is A, because it's morally right, and B, because it matters, it makes a difference. And I know that myself and the half a dozen others who then came, we made a difference, because what we did was we drew back a curtain and we showed the public the real toxic nature of these kind of politics, because people are not stupid, and too often are the electorate underestimated. And they know if people with that career are walking away and calling out that leader, their own leader, people don't do that lightly in politics, because end your career, then there's something seriously amiss. And in that election of the 13th of December 2019, the Labour Party had its worst result since 1935. And coming back from the doorstep, the candidates were saying to me, the Labour candidates, it's not Brexit, Joan, it's not to do with Europe. They're saying, we can't vote for that man, he's awful, isn't he? And I'm sad to have to say this, but that's what we had to do. And there wasn't enough of us doing it, but it worked. And it makes, the reason I think that's a message of hope is because I think it shows some fundamental decency about the public, the people, if you can get that message across. And I feel that's what we did. And I'll always feel proud of that, and the people who stood and did it with me. Very, very proud.
So holding the leadership accountable at the cost of your own career, not only you, but a few colleagues as well, in your party, eventually got through to the public, and they held the party accountable at the elections, and it cost votes, and that's how they learned, right? So that leadership was out and new leadership came in. So you had an impact. You paid a big price, but you had an impact, and so did your colleagues who were doing similar things.
Yeah.
So that's very, very promising. Also, we can.
Evelyn, I have a great job now, so people shouldn't. And my colleagues who came with me have mostly thrived. So there are always those who will respect what you did. And the job I'm in now, it's the first time in my life that someone came and, I think call it headhunting, asked me to do the job. As a politician, you go around begging to do the job. Please vote for me. Give me the job.
That's great. So yes, so there is appreciation found afterwards for your handling.
It's its own reward, and it's not the end of the road.
Right.
There are people who see what you've done, and they appreciate it.
That's great to hear. That's
But
great
you
to
know,
hear.
this job I do now is so important because we're like, you know, we're non-party political, and we are building across the Parliament in the UK a community of members of Parliament who are pro-Israel, who are against anti-Semitism, who are willing to stand up on that. And we're connecting them right across Europe because LNet is based right across Europe. And
Hello. We seem to be frozen at the moment. Evelyn, are you there?
I'm there.
Okay, Joan seems to be frozen. Let's talk a little about what she's doing, that we know this is very important work to get people in the UK to understand about being pro-Israel without disconsidering, if that's such a word, everyone else. Actually, it looks like we've lost Joan at the moment. But let's give her a few minutes to get back. And there's something that she said that I want to emphasize. Number one, she's a hero. I mean, she went from being a bystander to being an upstander at a great personal risk. And it's incredible. But I just wanted to say something about my play. The title of my play is Thin Edge of the Wedge, and it is a British expression. It's exactly what she talked about. It's about not saying anything until the wedge becomes so big that it's too late. And that's what she was talking about. And she chose to speak up before it was too late.
Right in time.
Yes. And I think that it deserves a huge appreciation from our listeners that she modeled what good leadership can be, willing, in effect, to sacrifice your career. That's right? In order to speak up. So we're not asking our listeners to sacrifice their careers. What we are asking our listeners to do is to speak up at the very beginning of small things, such as if someone says something anti-Semitic in front of you, not to say, oh, it's just a whatever, but to say very calmly, for example.
And she was just in time because otherwise this anti-Semitic party leader could have become prime minister. The chances are high.
Yes.
And then that would have given a change to the total policy of the UK towards Jewish people, towards the state of Israel. And so it was very important what she and her colleagues did. And I'm happy to hear that she says that although the immediate price was high, it was also recognized and acknowledged by other people so that she could start a new interesting career. I'm happy to hear that. And also, I think she said that the voters heard her and her colleagues. And that's very important. But I think in the future, we can all hold our representatives accountable with the standards that she set, right?
Yes. I think she gave us all, as we would say, a blueprint for what's really important. And I think she's back.
Okay, that's good news.
Let's see.
Joan, welcome back.
And we've been talking about you in a very good way. We've been talking about what you said and saying to our listeners, this is a really heroic example of what people can do to go from being bystanders to upstanders, but that you put your whole career at risk, and we're not asking our listeners necessarily to do that, but really to learn from you. So I think this is a good time to say, what do you want to add that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
I think we probably covered most of it. I just think that, you know, we know there are people who are anti-Semitic, but I just think people need to know not to be a bystander. That, you know, there's strength when we all act together, and it's nothing to be frightened of. If we stand shoulder to shoulder and we stand up right from the outset, then that's how we fight this. And when I say fight it, I don't mean some kind of physical fight. I mean we stand together and we explain what it is, so that people who don't really understand it, we don't write them off. You know, we work at getting the message across. And the more of us doing that, the more successful we'll be. And the more successful we are, the more decent a community we'll all have to live in. So it's in all our interests. This isn't about being Jewish. This is about living in a decent society. Simple as.
Yes, and we all can join organizations that fight racism, including anti-Semitism, including anti-Zionism. Not all anti-racist organizations, unfortunately, are fighting anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism, but many are. So we can all join these organizations, one of these organizations, whether it's for campus or in society at large, and that is a way also of fighting together, right? They will give you advice and vice versa. You can give them advice.
And the Labour Party's changed. You know, it's still got a lot of work to do to root out all these anti-Semites, but it's working on it. It's got a better leadership. And it's really important because that's Her Majesty's official opposition. At the next general election, which has to happen by, I think it's June 2024, they could be the government. So this work isn't just, you know, to be nice to people. This is absolutely crucial work. Absolutely crucial. I want a government that will stand up to this kind of thing. I want to live in a democracy that's based on good, decent, fundamental values.
Yes, yes, absolutely. We thank you so much for this absolutely enlightening and inspiring discussion. We thank our listeners for listening. Any of you who have not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, I highly, highly recommend it. You can see it on Amazon or YouTube. For more information about my Thin Edge of the Wedge play, which, by the way, is a British expression, as I was saying when you were off, you can see it at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And everyone, without putting yourself in physical harm, whenever you can, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.